beneath the dazzling lights of Il Cielo, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, perched on the 47th floor above the beating heart of New York, Alessandro Moretti, the most powerful mafia boss in the city, was preparing to close a flawless 2-year anniversary evening with his fiancée, Isabella Romano. The very moment Isabella rose from her seat and slipped away toward the powder room, 2 elegant plates of chocolate dessert were brought to the table by an impeccably dressed waiter. In that very instant, a homeless girl of about 6 years old, wrapped in a threadbare sweater with her hair tangled in dusty knots, darted past the security guards, rushed to his side, and whispered into his ear in a trembling voice, "Sir, she put something in your cake." At first, Alessandro dismissed it as the panicked words of a lost child from the streets, but the moment he met her frightened brown eyes and saw the desperate urgency etched into her small face, every instinct honed by a lifetime spent among conspiracies and betrayals suddenly awakened within him. What unfolded in the seconds that followed would leave every soul present at Il Cielo that night frozen in stunned silence. The security guards descended upon her with practiced efficiency. Emma had no chance to say another word, only a fleeting instant to twist her small head back, to lock her hollowed brown eyes onto Alessandro's one final time, before she vanished behind the heavy oak door leading to the service corridor. The polished brass handle clicked shut. The velvet curtains fell back into place, as if she had never existed at all. The murmur of Il Cielo returned around him like water closing over a stone. The delicate clink of silver against porcelain, the soft rippling of a piano nocturne from the far end of the dining room, the polite laughter of a couple 3 tables away, a sommelier uncorking a bottle of vintage Barolo with a discreet, satisfying pop. The whole exquisite theater of wealth resumed as though nothing at all had happened, as though no barefoot ghost of a child had ever appeared at his table. But inside Alessandro's mind, the world had fallen utterly silent. He looked down at the 2 identical plates of chocolate soufflé beneath the golden candlelight, each one crowned with a paper-thin sheet of edible gold leaf, each one ringed by delicate droplets of raspberry coulis, red as fresh blood upon white porcelain, twin, indistinguishable, impossible to tell apart. And in the frozen hush of his thoughts, 2 years of Isabella flickered past him like frames of a film he had watched too many times to bear, her laughter carried across the water at Lake Como, her hair the color of chestnut honey in the afternoon sun, her arms wrapped around him in a shaking embrace after an assassin's bullet had grazed his shoulder some months before, her tears warm against his neck, her voice this very afternoon, whispering in his ear that she loved him more than she had ever loved anything in her life. The rational voice of a man who had built an empire screamed that the ravings of a homeless 6-year-old could not, must not, be treated as evidence. Yet the deeper voice, the one forged in decades of survival, among liars and traitors, and men who smiled while sharpening their knives, whispered the opposite. That those desperate eyes had not been lying, that some truths did not need decades to prove themselves. That instinct, in a world like his, was not a luxury, but the last thin line between a man and his grave. His gaze drifted toward the corridor leading to the powder room. 7 seconds, that was all the time he had left. His hand, the hand that had signed billion-dollar contracts in glass towers overlooking the city, that had squeezed a trigger on moonless nights along the East River, moved now with the quiet precision of pure instinct. Silent, without hesitation, without a single wasted gesture. He lifted one plate, he lifted the other, he set them down again in perfect mirror reversal, exactly as they had been, as if nothing at all had changed. Just as he drew his hand back to rest upon his knee, the crisp, unmistakable report of red Louboutin heels rang out against the polished marble floor behind him. Isabella slid back into her seat with the same effortless grace that had first drawn him to her 2 years ago. She reached across the linen tablecloth and laid her hand over his, her fingertips cool against his skin. "Forgive me, amor." There was a cue that would not move. A soft, apologetic laugh, "and I wanted to check something before I came back. Something for you." Alessandro's face held perfectly still. He had trained a lifetime for exactly this, to feel nothing, to show nothing, to sit across from a woman whose smile might have been meant as the last one he ever saw. "A gift?" he asked, and his voice betrayed nothing. "After dessert." Her eyes, hazel and flecked with old gold in the candlelight, glowed with a nervous tenderness he had never seen in her before. "I have waited 2 years to give it to you. A few more minutes will not kill me." The word struck him like a stray bullet grazing bone. He did not flinch. He only smiled, the smile of a man who had learned, before he had learned anything else, how to smile through everything. She lifted the silver spoon. She cut into the chocolate soufflé, the one that now sat before her, gleaming under candlelight, garnished with a thin sheet of gold leaf, and encircled by droplets of raspberry coulis. She lifted the first spoonful to her lips and closed her eyes as she tasted it, the way she always did with things she found beautiful. Alessandro lifted his own spoon. He pretended to eat. He turned the chocolate through the raspberry sauce, brought the spoon to his lips, let it hover, set it back down. All the while, his eyes never left her across the candlelight. 3 minutes passed. Isabella reached for her wine, and her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly against the crystal stem. She did not notice. She spoke of the trip they had planned to Sicily in the spring, of her grandmother's old house near Taormina, of the lemon groves she wanted him to see. 6 minutes passed. A faint gleam of perspiration had risen along her hairline, though the dining room was cool enough that the woman 2 tables away had draped a shawl across her shoulders. Isabella laughed at herself, laid a hand against her forehead. It is nothing. A little tired, perhaps. The champagne. 9 minutes. Her pupils bloomed wide and black, swallowing the gold in her eyes. She rose from her chair to reach for her wrap, and her legs did not obey. The world tilted beneath her. She reached for the edge of the table and missed. She fell a slow, terrible collapse across the white linen. The crystal wineglass shattered beneath her arm. Ruby wine bloomed across the tablecloth like a spreading wound. A thin, dark thread of blood traced its way from the corner of her lips down the pale line of her jaw. Alessandro was already moving. He caught her before she could strike the marble floor, gathered her broken weight against his chest, his hand cradling the back of her head. He roared for a doctor. His voice cracked open the polite murmur of Il Cielo, like a rifle shot in a church. Every diner froze mid-motion. Every glass paused between hand and lip. And in that suspended, unbearable heartbeat, holding the woman he loved as her breath grew shallow against his throat, Alessandro Moretti did not know whether he had just saved Isabella or poisoned her himself. No one leaves this room. Alessandro's voice cut through the frozen silence of Il Cielo like a blade drawn from ice. He did not raise it. He did not need to. Every server who had been rushing toward the collapsed woman stopped where they stood. Every diner who had risen from a chair sank slowly back into it. The maître d'hôtel, pale as the linen tablecloth Isabella had bled onto, opened his mouth to protest and thought better of it before a single sound escaped his throat. Lock the entrances. Lock the kitchen. No one leaves. No one uses a phone. Alessandro cradled Isabella against his chest, her weight limp, her pulse a thin, fluttering thing beneath his fingertips. He did not look away from her. He did not need to. Every soul in the room felt the weight of his command settle upon them like a stone dropped into still water. Marco Rossi arrived in 10 minutes flat. He came through the front doors in a black wool overcoat, the shoulder holster beneath his tailored vest catching the candlelight for the briefest of instants before it was gone again. 2 of his men flanked him, their eyes sweeping the room in a practiced sweep that catalogued every exit, every guest, every waiter's hand. He crossed the marble floor without hurry, without a single glance spared for the diners staring at him in mute terror, and knelt beside Alessandro. "Sir, the ambulance is on the street. Take Isabella. Mount Sinai, VIP wing. Dr. Antonelli meets us there." The paramedics entered a moment later, their green uniforms grotesque against the gilded walls. They lifted Isabella onto the stretcher with the careful reverence usually reserved for the dying. Her lips had turned the pale violet of a bruise. Her lashes lay dark and still against skin the color of wax. Alessandro rose. He did not release her hand until the stretcher wheels caught upon the threshold. He turned to Marco and spoke in a voice so quiet that only his consigliere could hear. The girl, small, 6 years old, brown sweater, dark tangled hair, she left through the service corridor with the guards. Find her, take her to the estate. Armored car, no sirens. She is not a hostage. She is not a witness. She is under my protection until I say otherwise. But she does not leave. Marco nodded once. Understood. Before he could give the order, a commotion erupted at the rear of the kitchen. A man in chef's whites, Antoine Marchetti, the executive chef of Il Cielo, was attempting to slip through the service exit with his coat already thrown over his uniform. Marco crossed the room in 6 long strides. There was no struggle, no shouted words, only a single, economical fist driven into the soft hollow beneath the chef's ribs. Marchetti folded silently to the tile floor, gasping like a landed fish. "This one comes with us," Marco said to his lieutenant. Alive, quiet, in the second car, within the hour, every security recording from every camera within 5 city blocks had been seized by Moretti men wearing the uniforms of a contracted maintenance company. Servers, dishwashers, valets, each one photographed, each name recorded, each phone temporarily confiscated. Alessandro stood alone at the center of the emptying dining room. Isabella's blood dried in a thin, dark crescent across his palm. The 2 anniversary candles still burned on the ruined table beside a shattered wine glass, their small flames trembling in the draft of the closing doors. The private elevator ascended in silence to the topmost floor of Mount Sinai Hospital, where the VIP wing sat behind a set of frosted glass doors that opened only to a keycard held by 3 people in the entire city. 2 of them were doctors. The third was Dr. Antonelli, the personal physician of the Moretti family, who was already waiting when the elevator chimed open. Isabella was wheeled through the corridor at a sprint, a ventilator mask clamped over her mouth, wires trailing from her chest to a monitor whose green line pulsed in shallow, uneven peaks. A young trauma surgeon shouted vitals across the hallway that Alessandro did not fully understand, but instinctively knew were bad. She disappeared through a set of double doors, and then those doors closed, and the world outside them became silent again. Alessandro sat down on a leather bench in the corridor. He looked at his hands. Dried blood traced the lines of his palm in fine dark rivers. Under his thumbnail, a fleck of it had already turned brown. He did not move to wash them. Somehow it seemed important that he not wash them yet. Marco lowered himself onto the bench beside him. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was low, quiet, without weight of accusation, merely the flat delivery of facts, the way a soldier reports a body count. "Sir." She reserved the table herself. She was the only one who spoke to the reservations desk. She asked for the private alcove and gave the seat placements. Alessandro at the window, herself across from him. A pause. She also selected the dessert, chocolate soufflé. She named it specifically. Twice. Alessandro did not answer. Only she knew which plate would arrive in front of you. Still, Alessandro said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere on the pale marble floor, though he was not seeing it. He was seeing Isabella's hands trembling around the crystal stem of her wineglass. He was seeing the pale sheen of sweat along her hairline. He was seeing the way her pupils had bloomed impossibly wide before her body had folded across the table. A junior physician emerged from the double doors, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable in the way that only very young doctors bearing very bad news can achieve. "Sir, preliminary toxicology has come back." She looked briefly down at the sheet, then up again. "Strychnine, a lethal concentration. If she had ingested another mouthful, she would not have survived to reach us." She gave a small bow of her head and retreated back through the doors. Marco did not turn to look at Alessandro. He simply waited. Within Alessandro's chest, 2 voices had begun to war against each other. One roared impossible. Isabella. Not Isabella. The woman who had held him through fever after the March ambush. The woman who had cried against his shoulder at his mother's grave. Not her. Never her. The other voice, colder, older, born from the marrow of 3 prior attempts on his life, had already begun assembling the pieces. The uncharacteristic tension in her shoulders all evening, the mysterious gift she had promised but never quite delivered, the way only she had known where he would sit, which plate would be his, what flavor he would taste last. Alessandro closed his eyes. The woman he loved, the woman who might have killed him, both, at the same time. Dawn came thin and gray over the Upper East Side, filtering through the leaded windows of the Moretti estate, in shafts that struck the marble floors like blades of pale light. The 4-story brownstone had stood behind its wrought iron gates for more than a century, its facade unchanged, its interior belonging to a world few outsiders had ever seen. In its sub-basement, 3 levels below the servants' quarters, lay the security room. 48 monitors stretched across the far wall in a black grid, their soft blue glow the only illumination in the concrete chamber. 2 Moretti technicians sat at the central console. Alessandro stood behind them, still wearing the same blood-stained shirt from the previous night, the collar rumpled, the cuffs stiffened with dried russet along the hems. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had washed his hands only long enough to touch Isabella's forehead before the surgeons had wheeled her into intensive care. Marco stood at his shoulder, his left arm no longer holding his overcoat but a paper cup of black coffee. "Play everything from the service corridor." Starting 1 hour before we were seated, the technician's fingers moved across the console, the middle screens filled with grainy black and white footage of Il Cielo's service corridor on the 47th floor, the narrow passage between the kitchen and the emergency stairwell, walled in dark wood, lit by discreet sconces, meant to guide only the staff. For 38 minutes, nothing. Waiters moved with silver trays. A sommelier passed with a wooden crate of vintage bottles. A busboy paused to fix the cuff of his black shirt. Then, at 45 minutes before the reservation, A woman appeared in the frame. She wore a deep ruby red dress, sleeveless, cut in a straight column that fell to just below the knee. Her hair fell loose and dark across her shoulders, the same rich chestnut brown as Isabella's, the same height, the same slim, elegant carriage. From behind, from any distance, from any angle a witness might later be asked to describe, she was Isabella Romano. Alessandro leaned toward the monitor until his breath fogged the glass. Freeze. The image stopped. The woman was captured mid-stride, her right foot lifted slightly from the polished floor of the corridor. Alessandro's eyes went to her feet. Flat black ballerina slippers, soft leather, no heel. The kind of shoe a dancer might wear to a rehearsal, or a mother might wear chasing a small child through a garden. Isabella did not own a single flat shoe. Not one. Alessandro had walked into her closet 100 times over 2 years and never seen anything below 3 inches, even on the marble of her own kitchen at breakfast. Even in the tiled courtyard of her villa in Positano, she wore heels. It was, she had once laughed, the only vanity her grandmother had ever passed down to her. Advance frame by frame, the woman walked again. 10 paces, 12. Alessandro saw it now. Her gait was too straight, too rigid, the controlled march of a soldier crossing a parade ground. Isabella walked with a subtle sway of the hips, an unconscious rhythm born of a lifetime in heels. This was not Isabella. This was someone dressed as Isabella. Alessandro's hand closed slowly into a fist at his side, his knuckles blanched white against the darkened skin. He had spent the entire night suspecting the woman he loved. Based on a costume, 2 floors below the security room, deeper still into the bones of the Moretti estate, lay a chamber that appeared on no architectural drawing filed with the city. It had no windows. Its walls were poured concrete, its floor sloped subtly toward a central drain, and its ceiling held a single industrial pendant lamp, whose bulb burned at a wattage that turned everything beneath it into stark relief and shadow. Antoine Marchetti sat bound to a heavy oak chair at the center of that light. The chef's whites he had worn the night before were streaked with sweat and something darker along one sleeve where he had bitten through his own lip in the transport car. His hands were tied at the wrists behind the chair back. His feet were bound at the ankles to the front legs. The knots were neat, professional, and had not been retied since his arrival. Marco Rossi stood before him with his overcoat folded neatly across one arm, the way a man might carry a jacket while waiting in the lobby of a bank. His expression was that of someone who had all the time in the world, and no particular preference about how it was spent. 2 floors above them, in the security room, Alessandro Moretti sat alone before an intercom speaker. He listened. For the first hour, Marchetti gave nothing. Denials at first, then indignation, then a rehearsed story about a supplier who had brought in a batch of hazelnut cream that must have gone rancid. Marco did not interrupt. Marco did not respond at all. He simply stood and waited, and allowed the silence between each lie to grow longer than the lie itself. The second hour arrived. Marchetti's voice began to fray at the edges. His eyes darted to the door that would not open, to the pendant lamp that would not dim, to the man before him who did not move. At the beginning of the 3rd hour, he broke. His shoulders folded inward, his head sank forward until his chin touched his chest, and in a voice hoarse from the dryness of the room, he began, finally, to tell the truth. 100,000. In cash. American hundreds. Delivered in a plain brown paper bag left inside my locker 2 nights before. No note, no name. He swallowed. His throat clicked in the silence. 45 minutes before the reservation, a woman came in through the service door. Red dress, long dark hair, same build as the fiancé. I thought at first she was the fiancé. She handed me a small glass vial. Clear liquid. Strychnine, she said. She told me to blend it into the cream layer of the chocolate soufflé. Only the plate marked for table 1. He drew a shuddering breath. She said if I tried to warn anyone, my daughter in Marseille would be dead by morning. Marco did not move. Her name? I don't know. I swear to God I don't know. She never gave one. She left through the eastern fire exit before service began. That is everything I have. Everything. 2 floors above. Alessandro closed his eyes. 2 feelings surged through him at once, each fighting for the same narrow space inside his chest. Relief, blinding and complete, that Isabella had never once betrayed him. And beneath it, colder and heavier and impossible to wash clean, the numb, dead weight of knowing that for 3 unforgivable minutes, he had believed she had. The Moretti reconnaissance team worked through the afternoon and into the failing light of evening, tracing the woman in the red dress through the vast unblinking network of surveillance cameras that watched over every corner of Manhattan. Traffic cameras, bodega cameras, the private lenses mounted above jewelry stores and bank vestibules. Each grainy frame was passed through facial matching software in a windowless office 3 blocks from the estate. They followed her east from the eastern fire exit of Il Cielo, down a service alley behind a Korean grocer, into the back of a taxi whose plates had been muddied with what appeared to be deliberate care. The taxi crossed into the East Village and stopped outside a shabby residential hotel on Avenue B, the kind of building whose lobby smelled of stale cigarettes, and whose front desk clerk asked no questions of anyone willing to pay in cash. She had checked in 3 days earlier under the name Sophia Bianchi. The passport she had used was Italian. It was also, upon closer examination, a very expensive forgery. Marco arrived at dusk with 6 of his best men. They took the stairwell in silence. 2 men on the roof, 2 on the fire escape, Marco himself and 1 lieutenant on the 3rd floor landing, at the door of room 308. She was gone by the time Marco's boot broke the lock. The window was open. The curtain billowed in the cold October wind. On the bed lay a wig of long dark chestnut hair Isabella's shade, cut and styled to match, and beside it, the red dress folded with the deliberate care of a professional, leaving nothing to accident. She had dressed in black, athletic clothes, dark sneakers with rubber soles, and she was already moving across the rooftops of Alphabet City. Marco followed her out the window without breaking stride. The chase moved across 6 buildings in the space of 90 seconds. Tar paper roofs slick with the season's first frost. Ventilation shafts that had to be leapt over rather than around, the muffled cough of a silenced pistol splitting the cold air twice. 3 times, each shot missing by the width of a hand. She was faster than any woman Marco had ever pursued. She knew this city. She knew this route. She had planned this escape with the same meticulous cruelty as the poisoning itself. She dropped down a rusted fire ladder into a narrow alley behind a shuttered bakery on East 4th Street. Marco was 2 seconds behind her. His hand closed on the shoulder of her jacket. Then both ends of the alley erupted. Muzzle flashes bloomed from the mouth of the north entrance. Return fire lanced from the south. 6 gunmen he had not seen, positioned behind dumpsters and delivery vans, opened up in a coordinated ambush that had clearly been planned to cover exactly this moment of exposure. A black SUV surged into the alley from Avenue A with its tires screaming. Marco felt the round strike his left forearm before he heard it, a sharp punch through the muscle just below the elbow, the sleeve of his coat blooming dark. He kept his footing. He raised his weapon. But by the time he steadied his aim, the woman had already vaulted into the open passenger door of the SUV. She was gone. But something had fallen from her jacket in the moment she climbed inside. A slim black phone lay in the gutter, its screen dark against the wet asphalt. The phone reached the estate before midnight, sealed inside an evidence bag still tacky with the wet asphalt of the East 4th Street gutter. Marco had refused to allow the field medic to sew his forearm shut until he had personally handed the device across the workbench of the Moretti Technical Wing, 3 floors below the security room, where 2 engineers waited under harsh white light. It took them 3 hours. The device had been wiped, or so its owner had believed. Its local storage was blank, its call history purged, its message thread scoured with a commercial deletion tool that would have satisfied a lesser adversary. But the woman in the red dress had made one mistake. The same mistake made by every professional who trusts a phone too long. The device had been paired to a cloud account, and the cloud account had continued syncing right up until the moment its battery had been pulled in the gutter. 21 encrypted messages, 6 brief video clips of the interior of Il Cielo, filmed for reconnaissance during the days before the reservation, and, at the very bottom of the recovered file tree, 1 voice recording that had never been deleted at all, 2 minutes and 11 seconds long, saved under the file name briefing. Final. Marco entered Alessandro's study with his arm freshly bandaged beneath a fresh shirt. He carried a small speaker in his uninjured hand. "Sir, you need to hear this yourself." He set the speaker on the desk. He pressed play. The voice that filled the room was thick, unhurried, weighted by an accent that carried the old iron of the outer Bronx, the drawn vowels, the flattened consonants of a man who had grown up in tenements north of Fordham Road and had never entirely left them behind. Dress like her. Same dress, same hair, same height. You've been practicing the walk, practice it more. Deliver the money to the chef in a paper bag. No note, no name. Slip the vial into his hand and disappear through the east fire door before service begins. Now listen to this part carefully, because this is the whole reason we do it this way. When Moretti drops, his men are going to tear that room apart looking for who did it, and they are going to find her fingerprints on the reservation, her voice on the recording placing the order, her name on the wine list. Every single trail leads back to Isabella Romano. The point is not just to bury Moretti. The point is to make his family believe she buried him. His lieutenants tear each other apart, hunting for her friends, her cousins, her uncles. His organization eats itself from the inside. And by the time the dust clears, the docs belong to us. Understood? The recording ended. Marco's face had gone the color of chalk. Sir, I know that voice. Alessandro did not turn from the window. He was staring out at the sodium lights along Fifth Avenue as though he had never seen them before. Salvatore Ricci, the name of the Queen's capo who had been quietly circling the Moretti waterfront for 3 years, who had lost 2 of his own cousins in the shipping war of the previous spring, who had every reason in the world to want Alessandro dead, and every colder reason still to want the Moretti bloodline poisoned from within before the funeral was even held. Marco left the study without another word, understanding without being told that his employer required, above all else, to be alone. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. Alessandro Moretti sat down in the leather chair behind his father's mahogany desk. He did not rise again for a long time. The only light in the room came from a single antique brass lamp positioned at the corner of the desk, a lamp his grandfather had bought in Palermo before the war, whose green glass shade cast a small pool of jaundiced illumination across the blotter and left the rest of the study drowned in shadow. Beyond the tall windows, Manhattan pulsed with its cold electric glow. The city did not know, and would not know, what had almost happened to it that night. Alessandro looked at his hands. They were clean now. Someone had drawn him a bath at some point during the last hour. The blood had been washed away in the porcelain, swirled down the drain, gone forever. And yet he could still feel it, the dried crescent along his palm, the fleck beneath his thumbnail, the weight of Isabella's head in the cradle of his arm as she folded across the anniversary table. 3 minutes. That was the length of time. He had timed it precisely, unable to help himself, sitting on the leather bench outside intensive care, while Marco delivered his flat report of facts. From the moment the toxicology sheet had left the young physician's hand, to the moment the security footage from Il Cielo had first shown him the flat black ballerina slippers of an imposter, 3 minutes, 180 seconds. For 180 seconds, he had believed that Isabella Romano had poisoned him. Isabella, who had held him through the sweating fever after March, when the surgeon had cut the bullet out of his shoulder with only whiskey for anesthetic, who had wept silently against his ribs at his mother's graveside and had never once told anyone that she had, who had chosen a small, quiet trattoria in the village for their second date because she had noticed, without being told, that crowds made him watchful and tired, who was, in a matter of months, to have become his wife. For 180 seconds, he had put her in the same silent tribunal that he had built inside himself, over 20 years of surviving liars and traitors, and men who smiled while sharpening their knives and, for 180 seconds, he had believed her guilty. There are wounds that never bleed. There are betrayals no enemy delivers, because they arrive from within, from the moment a lover, in the weakest instant of his heart, forgets what he knows. Doubt, however brief, however swiftly redeemed, leaves its scar upon the soul. Not upon the soul of the one suspected, upon the soul of the one who suspected. Alessandro closed his eyes. If Emma had not appeared at his table tonight, if the plates had not been switched, if strychnine had done what strychnine was designed to do, he would have died believing that the woman he loved had killed him. And Isabella, over the years, would have been hunted through every corner of the earth by the men she considered her family. His men, his justice. He pressed his forehead against his folded hands. For the first time in 20 years, Alessandro Moretti wept. He rose from the desk at last, and walked the long corridor of the second floor, past the darkened portraits of Moretti men who had gone before him, past the tall, arched window that overlooked the walled garden. His steps made no sound upon the runner of deep Persian wool. The house was hushed at this late hour in the way only very old houses can be hushed. The settling of ancient beams, the faint tick of a clock in a room 3 doors away, the distant hum of the boiler in the cellar. He found her in the small sitting room at the end of the east wing, the one that faced the interior courtyard and had been his mother's favorite. A fire had been lit in the marble hearth. Signora Rosa sat in the wingback chair beside it, her silver hair drawn into a low, neat coil at the nape of her neck, her faded blue apron still tied at her waist. She was reading a battered copy of I Promessi Sposi by the low glow of a table lamp, and she looked up as Alessandro entered without either of them needing to speak. Rosa's eyes moved to the child in the armchair opposite hers, and then back to Alessandro. Her expression required no translation. She rose, kissed his cheek with the tenderness of a woman who had known him since he was younger than the girl, now curled into the leather cushions, and left the room without a word. Emma sat huddled at the center of a chair too vast for her small body. Her legs did not reach the floor. Her arms were wrapped around a plate that held a single slice of white bread, with a pat of butter melting into it, and she was eating it in small, careful bites the way a child eats a thing when she has never been sure whether the next meal will come. She did not look up when Alessandro entered. She had learned, out on the streets, that not looking up was often safer than looking up. Alessandro crossed the room. He removed his suit jacket, laid it over the back of the sofa, and then for the first time in his adult life, he lowered himself onto one knee before another human being. He knelt until his eyes were level with hers. Emma, her small dark head lifted. The woman you saw tonight in the kitchen of that restaurant, the one in the red dress, that was not the woman you saw sitting at my table. They are two different women. The one you saw giving money to the chef was pretending to be her. She was hired to hurt me, and to make my family believe someone else had done it. The child went utterly still. The bread trembled in her small fingers. But I thought she. Her voice was very small. I thought she was. And then the tears came. Not the delicate weeping of adult grief, but the great heaving sobs of a 6-year-old whose whole small world had just tilted on its axis. I thought I helped save you, but I hurt her. I almost killed her. Alessandro reached forward and gathered her into his arms. His hands were clumsy. He did not remember how to hold a child, if he had ever known at all. But his arms were warm and steady, and they did not let go. You saved me. That is the only truth that matters. Against his shoulder, Emma cried until she had no more crying left in her. He held her through every moment of it, his chin resting lightly upon the top of her tangled hair, and he made no attempt to stop her. When she had gone quiet at last, when her breathing had begun to slow into the ragged rhythm of a child at the very edge of exhausted sleep, the phone in his pocket buzzed against his thigh. He drew it out with one hand. Marco, from Mount Sinai, sir. She just opened her eyes. The private suite on the topmost floor of Mount Sinai Hospital was quiet in the way that only rooms holding the newly saved can be quiet. The monitors had ceased their frantic beeping and settled into a steady, patient rhythm. The ventilator had been withdrawn hours earlier. A single vase of white roses sat upon the windowsill, arranged by a nurse who had known better than to ask who had sent them. Isabella Romano lay against a bank of pillows, her skin the pale color of old ivory, her dark hair spread loose across the linen. An intravenous line traced the delicate vein along the inside of her left wrist. She was awake. She was thin and exhausted, and the strychnine had left her breath shallow. But her eyes, when they found Alessandro standing in the doorway, were the same warm hazel he had memorized across 2 years of quiet evenings. He crossed the room in silence and lowered himself onto the chair beside her bed. He took her hand between both of his and lifted it, very gently, to his lips. Isabella, amore. Her voice was a threadbare whisper, but her smile was hers, entirely hers. He held her hand against his forehead for a long moment. Then he lifted his eyes to her face. And for the first time in a life built on quiet omission and careful silence, Alessandro Moretti spoke with a truth that cost him everything. I have to tell you something, and you must hear all of it before you say anything. Her fingers tightened around his. When the toxicology came back tonight, before we found the footage of the imposter in the service corridor for 3 minutes, I believed it was you. I sat outside this room, and Marco laid the facts before me. And for 3 minutes I thought that the woman I love had poisoned me at our anniversary dinner. He could not look at her as he said it. He looked at her hand, at the small pale scar along the base of her thumb from a childhood accident with a garden gate. 3 minutes. I know that is not long, but I need you to know that I sat here believing it, and I need you to decide, knowing that, whether you still want the ring on your finger. For a long moment Isabella did not answer. Then a single tear slid from the corner of her eye down the pale line of her temple, and she smiled that same small, tired, radiant smile. Alessandro, if it had been you lying in that bed, and me sitting in that chair with the same evidence in front of me, I would have doubted you too. For longer than 3 minutes. Perhaps for the rest of my life. Her thumb brushed against his knuckle. That is not a betrayal, my love. That is how you have stayed alive long enough for me to reach you. He bowed his head over her hand, and in the hush of the private room on the topmost floor of Mount Sinai Hospital, for the second time in the space of a single night, Alessandro Moretti wept. When he had gathered himself, he rose and walked to the doorway, and there, in the shadow of the corridor, stood Emma. Her small hands were twisted together at her waist. She had not dared to step across the threshold. Alessandro knelt beside her. He whispered into her ear the whole shape of what had happened. When he had finished, He took her hand and walked her to the foot of the bed. Isabella opened her arms. "Come here, my brave girl." Emma ran. She flung herself into Isabella's embrace and cried into the hollow of her shoulder as though she had been carrying that grief across every alley of every burrow of her small, hard life. Isabella held her close, her lips against the tangled hair. "If I had been you, my brave girl, I would have done exactly what you did to save a life." Above the child's head, Isabella found Alessandro's eyes. "We have to take her home. A real home." The Moretti estate stood at the quiet end of a tree-lined street in the Upper East Side, 4 stories of dark brownstone behind a wrought iron gate that had been forged in Naples more than a century before. From the street it looked like any of the other elegant townhouses on the block. From within, it was a small kingdom. The armored car brought Emma home a little after 10 in the morning. Alessandro stepped out first, and then he turned and offered his hand to the small figure still buckled into the enormous leather seat. She looked at his open palm for a long moment, then she placed her tiny fingers into it and slid down onto the sidewalk. She stopped at the foot of the marble staircase inside the entrance hall. The ceiling soared above her, coffered in dark walnut, and hung with a chandelier of Murano glass whose crystals threw small rainbows across the polished floor. A gilt mirror as tall as a doorway leaned against the wall. The staircase itself curved upward in a slow, deliberate arc, each step veined with pale green marble from a quarry outside Verona. Emma tilted her head back until her neck could tilt no further, and she did not move. Her fingers had gone very tight around Alessandro's. Signora Rosa came down the staircase toward them, with the unhurried grace of a woman who had walked those same steps for 40 years. Her silver hair was gathered into a low, neat coil. Her faded blue apron was tied at her waist as it had been every morning since the day Alessandro's mother had first hired her. She stopped 3 steps from the bottom and knelt down until her eyes were level with the child's. "Benvenuta a casa, piccolina." She opened her arms. She did not reach out. She simply opened them, and she waited. Emma looked up at Alessandro. He nodded, very gently. The small brown head disappeared into Rosa's embrace. The rest of the day arrived in wonders too many for one small heart to hold. A bathtub deep enough to swim in, whose porcelain sides had been warmed by Rosa's own hands before the water was drawn. A cake of lavender soap that smelled like the fields outside a village Emma would never know the name of. A stack of new clothes laid across the foot of a bed, soft cotton nightgowns. A wool cardigan the color of cream. Small leather shoes that fit her exactly. A room of her own, papered in pale rose, with a window that looked down upon the walled garden. A bed so soft that when Emma first climbed onto it, she froze, terrified she might damage it beyond repair. That first night, Rosa sat on the edge of the mattress and brushed the child's damp hair with slow, patient strokes. And Emma, in the halting voice of a child who had never before had anyone to tell, began to speak. Of a mother named Elena, who had grown thin and gray at the edges before Emma had reached her 5th birthday, and who had gone to sleep one evening and had never woken up. Of an aunt who had taken her home for exactly 9 days before leaving her on a wooden bench in Grand Central Terminal with a paper bag containing 3 apples and a pair of mittens. Of the nights she had crept into the vestibule of St. Agnes to escape the cold, and of the old sacristan who had pretended not to see her. In the shadow of the doorway, Alessandro stood listening. He turned his face into the darkness of the corridor and did not permit himself to make a sound. Some days later, Isabella was discharged from Mount Sinai. She walked back into the house on her own 2 feet, thinner and paler than before but upright, and she found Alessandro and Emma waiting in the entrance hall. That evening, 3 places were set at the long dining table for the first time. Rosa brought out a tureen of ribollita and a warm loaf of bread. Alessandro sat at the head. Isabella sat to his right, and between them, on a chair that had been raised with 2 cushions so she could reach her bowl, sat a small girl in a cream cardigan whose hair had been brushed until it shone. The shape of a family had begun to appear at that table, no more solid yet than the steam rising from the soup, but there, undeniably, unmistakably there. 3 weeks passed in the Moretti house. They were 3 weeks of a kind Alessandro had not known since he was himself a boy running the long carpeted corridors of the same brownstone in short trousers. In the mornings, Emma appeared at the breakfast table with her hair still slightly damp from the bath. Rosa insisted upon each dawn, her small feet swinging beneath a chair still raised by 2 cushions. She had begun to eat without watching each bite as though it might be taken from her. She had begun, sometimes, to smile. In the afternoons, Alessandro found himself doing things he could not have imagined doing a month before. He sat in his father's leather armchair by the library fire, with a small girl folded across his lap, and he read her the old stories his own mother had once read to him. Pinocchio, the true one, not the sweetened version with its wooden boy who ran from every good thing that tried to save him. La Bella Addormentata, the Italian sleeping beauty, with its enchanted castle grown thick with thorns. Emma listened with her small hand curled against the lapel of his shirt, and when she was frightened by a passage, she pressed her cheek against his chest, and Alessandro would feel a strange, fierce ache rise beneath his ribs, and would find that he did not know what to do with it except keep reading. In the evenings, Isabella taught her small things: how to fold a linen napkin into the shape of a swan, with a beak so precise it seemed to swim across the tablecloth; how to arrange calla lilies in a low crystal bowl so that they leaned toward the light; how to write her name in the sloping cursive Isabella herself had learned from the nuns of a convent school in Milan. In the kitchen, Rosa took Emma under her flowered arm and taught her the older things: how to knead pasta dough on the great oak work table that had been in that kitchen since before the First World War; how to pass it through the hand-cranked machine until it emerged in ribbons thin enough to read a newspaper through; how to test the water for gnocchi with the flat of the palm and know, without a thermometer, when the moment had come. Somewhere in the second week, without warning, without ceremony, Emma began to use two words she had not used before: Papa, softly, uncertainly, as though she were not sure the ground would hold beneath her when she said it. Mama, whispered into the folds of Isabella's silk robe as she was tucked into bed. Each time one of the words emerged, Alessandro and Isabella found each other's eyes across the top of the small dark head between them, and neither of them dared speak. Their gaze carried an entire unspoken future: a wedding not yet planned, an adoption not yet filed, a life not yet promised in any language they had permitted themselves to use. But 3 streets away, from the rooftop of an apartment building whose upper floors had been quietly leased through a shell company the week before, a pair of professional binoculars was fixed upon the windows of the Moretti estate. Every entrance, every drawn curtain, every shadow that crossed a window. That same afternoon, Marco Rossi entered the study with a folded slip of paper he had not permitted to be sent electronically. Sir, Ricci is moving. 60 additional shooters flown in from Chicago in the past 96 hours. Heavy weapons through the Newark docks, cases marked as agricultural equipment. He is not licking his wounds. He is preparing. Alessandro said nothing. He walked to the tall window of his study and looked down at the walled garden, where Emma was chasing a copper leaf across the flagstones with the delighted shriek of a child who had never in her life been permitted to shriek. Every home built inside the world of a man like Alessandro Moretti stands upon the edge of a knife. So long as the predator still breathes, no wall is ever thick enough, no door is ever locked enough, no love, however great, is ever enough by itself to keep the darkness at the gate. The Sunday afternoon came bright and cold across the city, the kind of clean autumn afternoon that promises nothing worse than a chill in the wind and the smell of roasting chestnuts from a corner cart. Emma had been asking about the gelato shop in Little Italy for 4 days running. Pistachio, she had heard Rosa say. Pistachio, made the old way, ground with the same stone the shop had used for 80 years. Emma had turned the word over in her mouth like a small green marble, and had asked Isabella, at last, whether they might go. Isabella had said yes. They set out at 3 in the afternoon in a black Escalade with polarized windows and armor plating hidden beneath the trim. 2 bodyguards rode in the front, Antonio at the wheel, Gino in the passenger seat. Both men Marco had personally trained, both men who had ridden with the Moretti family for more than a decade. Isabella sat in the back with Emma buckled against her side. The child wore her cream cardigan and a small red beret Rosa had knitted for her in the second week of her stay. They reached the gelato shop on Mulberry Street a little after 3:30. Emma pressed her face against the glass counter and gazed at the dozen tubs of color, as though she were looking at the crown jewels of Europe. She chose pistachio. Isabella chose lemon. They ate their cones on a small iron table on the sidewalk, while a street musician played a slow accordion at the corner. Emma laughed at something Isabella said, and green gelato smeared across her chin, and Isabella wiped it away with a linen napkin and pressed her lips to the top of the small red beret. They climbed back into the Escalade at 4:15. At the intersection of Mulberry and Grand, 3 black SUVs came out of nowhere. The first blocked the front, the second slammed into the rear quarter panel with the crunch of tearing steel, the third boxed the driver's side door. Antonio reached for his weapon, a fraction of a second too late. Gunfire. Short, brutal, professional. The reinforced glass of the driver's side window held for 2 rounds and shattered on the third. Antonio slumped forward against the wheel. Gino was hit before he could clear his holster. 4 seconds. That was all it took to strip the Escalade of its protection. Isabella wrapped her body around Emma in the back seat and turned her spine toward the door. Close your eyes, my brave girl. Do not look. Do not look. Emma pressed her small face into the hollow of Isabella's throat and did not look. The rear door was torn open with a hydraulic pry bar. Rough hands seized Isabella by the upper arms and dragged her out. Another set of hands lifted Emma by the waist. Black canvas hoods were dropped over both their heads. Isabella heard the roar of a diesel engine somewhere to her left. She was shoved through the sliding door of an unmarked panel van. Emma was placed beside her. Metal clanged shut. The van accelerated. 4 hours later, in the study of the Moretti estate, an encrypted email arrived at Alessandro's private address from a sender registered under a shell in the Cayman Islands. The attachment was a video file, 1 minute and 47 seconds long. Salvatore Ricci sat before a plain gray backdrop, with a glass of red wine held loosely in his right hand. Behind him, bound to 2 wooden chairs, blindfolded but visibly breathing, sat Isabella and Emma, the entire waterfront, Brooklyn included, all of it, signed over on paper by tomorrow evening, or these two do not see another sunrise. The screen went black. The screen had not been dark for a full minute before Alessandro Moretti moved. He picked up the receiver on his desk and gave 3 orders in the same flat voice with which he had once ordered his morning coffee. The great room on the ground floor was to be prepared. Every capo and lieutenant loyal to the Moretti name was to be there within the hour, and Marco was to bring him a map of every borough east of the Hudson, current within the last 24 hours. 37 men entered the great room before the clock struck 9. They came from every corner of the 5 boroughs, from the shipping offices along the East River, from the construction sites of Long Island City, from the private clubs along Arthur Avenue in the Bronx. They took their places along the long walnut table, in a silence that no one needed to command. Every one of them had known Isabella since the engagement. More than a few had held Emma on their knee during the 3 weeks of what they had come to call, quietly among themselves, the miracle. Alessandro entered last. He stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. No surrender. No public negotiation. No paper is to be signed. But every man in this room is to appear to be negotiating. I want the message going out on every channel Ricci is monitoring that we are gathering signatures, calling notaries, weighing the offer. He must believe we are afraid. He must believe he has the time to enjoy his wine. He laid his hands upon the long walnut table. Buy us 6 hours. That is all I ask. The men rose. Within minutes, the great room emptied out into the corridors of the estate, and from there into the streets of the city, 37 separate performances of hesitation and grief that would ripple outward through every listening post Ricci had built. At the same moment, 5 miles away, in the sealed rear of an unmarked panel van running along the Brooklyn side streets, Isabella Romano bent her lips close to a small hooded head. Emma, listen to me carefully. Can you feel your bracelet? Beneath the hood, Emma nodded against Isabella's collarbone. The bracelet had been Rosa's gift on the child's 4th night in the house. Simple wooden beads on a length of waxed cotton thread. Rosa had strung it herself at the kitchen table while the kettle whistled, choosing the beads one by one from an old glass jar, red, yellow, blue, green, and a single carved pearl at the clasp. Emma had not taken it off since. I want you to be very quiet, and I want you to slide your small fingers around to the clasp. Feel for the knot. Untie it, very slowly. Do not let anyone hear. Emma's small hands moved beneath the sleeve of the cream cardigan. Every time the van stops, and it will stop, my brave girl, at every red light and every stop sign, I want you to slip 1 bead through the crack beneath the door. 1 bead, just 1, then wait for the next stop. Can you do this? Another nod. Over the 2 hours that followed, in the darkness behind the black canvas hood, in the shuddering rear of a van whose driver believed himself unwatched, a 6-year-old with no formal education and no toys of her own, performed the most careful act of navigation of her small life. A red bead at the corner of Atlantic and Court, a yellow one at Smith and 9th, a blue one at the on-ramp to the Gowanus. By the time Marco reached the estate at dawn with a tablet in his uninjured hand and an expression that Alessandro had not seen him wear in 10 years, 3 of Rosa's beads had already been recovered by the 30 technicians combing every traffic camera in South Brooklyn. Red, yellow, blue. The trail led south along the industrial belt and terminated at a derelict warehouse complex on the edge of Red Hook, hard against the abandoned container piers where the Erie Basin met the tide. The evening came down cold and clear over the walled garden. The last of the copper leaves had fallen from the 2 ancient maples along the eastern wall, and their bare branches stood black against a sky that carried no moon. At 10 o'clock, a long oak table was carried out of the pantry by 4 of Marco's men and set upon the flagstones at the center of the garden. Kerosene lamps were placed at each of its 4 corners, their small yellow flames unwavering in the still air. In the very middle of the table, an engineer from the estate's technical wing, laid a three-dimensional model of the derelict warehouse complex at Red Hook, printed to precise scale from the drone reconnaissance flown across the previous hour under the cover of a passing news helicopter. 6 of Alessandro's most seasoned scouts stood along the far side of the table. They had been on the ground in Red Hook since the first beat had emerged from the traffic footage. Their report was delivered in the flat-clipped cadences of men who did not exaggerate for effect. Approximately 20 gunmen guarded the compound. The defensive posture was doubled. An outer ring watched the rooftops of the 3 adjacent warehouses and the main gate onto Van Brunt Street. An inner ring encircled the central structure itself, a 2-story steel-framed building that had once served as the offices of a defunct shipping line. The hostages were being held in the core room on the 2nd floor, an interior office with no windows. Only one door, walls of reinforced concrete, rather than the corrugated steel of the exterior. Marco listened in silence until the last of the scouts had finished. Then he turned to Alessandro and spoke in the tone he had used with him perhaps 3 times in 20 years of service. "Sir, I have to ask you once, and then I will not ask you again." Alessandro raised his eyes. "Do not come with us. You are the head of this family. If you fall tonight, everything Ricci wanted from the poisoning he gets for free. Let me take them out. Let me bring them home to you." The 2 men looked at each other across the flickering lamplight for a long moment. "Marco, this is not an operation. This is my family. There is no world in which I am not the first man through that door." Marco inclined his head. He did not ask again. The plan took shape across the next hour in swift, exact strokes. 3 teams. The first would fast rope down from an unlit helicopter onto the roofs of the 2 flanking warehouses under cover of the harbor haze, silenced pistols and suppressed rifles only, clearing the outer perimeter in coordinated silence. The second would come in from the water, 6 men in a black inflatable boat launched from a slip north of the container piers, moving up along the seawall in dry suits, entering through the derelict pump house that stood at the western edge of the compound. The third, the main assault, would breach the front gate, the instant the outer ring had been neutralized, driving straight through to the core room on the 2nd floor. Weapons were distributed from a locked case brought up from the estate armory. Kevlar plates were fitted beneath dark tactical shells. Radios were paired and tested on an encrypted frequency Marco had personally set up that morning. The men filed out into the waiting vehicles. Alessandro remained a moment longer at the tall window of the sunroom that overlooked the garden. In the glass he could see his own reflection, dark shirt, dark trousers, holster already fitted, and beyond it, superimposed upon the black garden, the memory of a small girl 3 weeks earlier, sitting on 2 cushions at the head of the long dining table, laughing with pistachio ice cream on her chin as Rosa placed the first bowl of hand-cut pappardelle before her. He turned from the window and walked out to the cars. Midnight settled over the Red Hook waterfront in a thick harbor fog that muted the far lights of the container gantries to soft yellow smudges. The derelict warehouse compound sat at the end of Van Brunt Street like a black tooth in the mouth of the tide, its corrugated flanks streaked with rust, its broken windows staring out across the water. The rooftop team came in first. The helicopter had run dark and low along the buttermilk channel and had dropped 6 men onto the tar paper roof of the northern warehouse in a hover, so silent that the 2 sentries on the eastern parapet did not lift their eyes from the small orange glow of a shared cigarette. The muffled cough of suppressed pistols was less than the sound of a man clearing his throat. Both sentries folded onto the tar paper with no more noise than a coat sliding off a chair. 9 seconds later, a third guard on the adjacent roof followed them down. The harbor team came up next. 6 men in dark, dry suits climbed the algae-slick seawall behind the derelict pump house and moved through its hollow shell in single file. They emerged into the compound's western yard at the same moment the rooftop team's earpieces confirmed the outer ring was clear. 5 more of Ricci's men fell in the yard, 2 behind stacked pallets, 3 in the shadow of a rusted forklift. The whole action from water to yard took less than 90 seconds. The green light pulsed once across every earpiece on the encrypted channel. Alessandro Moretti drove his shoulder through the main gate of the compound with Marco Rossi at his right hand. The night erupted. Muzzle flashes bloomed along the interior of the great steel shell, orange starbursts against the dark. The main assault force poured through the breach behind them in a controlled wedge, 16 men trained to move together as though a single mind directed their limbs. Ricci's men fought hard, but they had been positioned for a siege, not a coordinated 3-vector strike. Layer after layer of the inner ring folded. 4 minutes. That was all it took to clear the ground floor of the central structure and reach the steel staircase that led upward to the 2nd story. Alessandro took the stairs 2 at a time. Marco followed at his shoulder, weapon high. The upper corridor was a narrow tunnel of rust-eaten steel walls. At its far end stood a door of heavy plate iron, welded shut along one seam, secured by a padlock the size of a man's fist, the core room. Behind that door, Marco pulled a small shaped charge from the pouch at his hip. He set it against the hinge, murmured the count, and turned his face to the wall. The blast punched the door inward in a shower of hot rivets. The smoke had not fully cleared before Alessandro was through. 2 wooden chairs stood in the center of the concrete room. Isabella was bound to one, Emma to the other. Duct tape covered both of their mouths. Their wrists were fastened behind the chair backs with plastic zip ties. Their eyes, when Alessandro entered, were swollen and red from crying, but they were open. They were alive. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He knelt before Emma. First, some deep instinct in him that could not have been named ordered him to free the child's mouth before anything else, and he peeled the tape away with a gentleness he did not know he possessed. Then he cut the ties at her wrists with the folding knife from his belt. Behind him, Marco was already working on Isabella. Isabella's voice cracked through her freed mouth in the smallest, hoarsest whisper. "I knew you would come. I told her. I told her you would come." Alessandro turned to her. He cut the last of her bindings. Emma's small arms flew up around his neck and locked there. For a single suspended moment inside that ruined concrete room, with the smoke of the breach still hanging in the air, and the distant rattle of the last of the mop-up fire echoing from below, it seemed to every soul present that the worst had already passed. Alessandro sliced through the last plastic tie binding Isabella's wrists, and let the severed loop fall to the concrete floor. He rose to his feet. Emma stood a pace behind him, her small hand still resting against the small of his back through the fabric of his tactical shell. Isabella was pushing herself upright with the trembling, careful effort of a woman who had knelt bound for too many hours. Alessandro turned his back to the far corner of the room, where a stack of old wooden crates rose against the concrete wall, abandoned shipping cases, the color of dried tobacco, their stenciled port markings faded to illegibility. Emma looked up over his shoulder. Her brown eyes flew open in a horror so absolute that the whole of her small face seemed to become nothing but those eyes. From behind the stacked crates, a figure stepped out. She moved with a limp, one of her legs dragged. Dried blood matted the dark chestnut hair to the side of her skull. Her red dress hung in ribbons along one shoulder where a round had grazed her the night of the East Village alley. She had not died. She had crawled out of the getaway SUV somewhere in the industrial dark of Brooklyn and had made her own way to Ricci's fortress and had waited, in the ruined patience of a professional who had been robbed of a single kill, for exactly this moment. The pistol in her hand was steady. It was aimed at the center of Alessandro's back. Emma did not hesitate. She did not think. 6 years of survival on the coldest sidewalks of Manhattan had not taught her hesitation and had never permitted her the luxury of thought. She simply moved. She flew across the small space with a speed that no adult in that room could have anticipated from a child of her size, and she wrapped both of her small arms around Alessandro from behind, and she turned her small back to the muzzle of the gun. The report was sharp and small in the concrete chamber. The round entered Emma's left shoulder just below the collarbone and lodged against the scapula on the far side of her body. Her small frame jerked once against Alessandro's spine, and then went limp, and slid down the back of his tactical shell like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Alessandro caught her as she fell. He turned her against his chest. Her cream cardigan, dyed dark now, blossomed in a widening stain that pressed against the plate carrier over his own heart. The impostor adjusted her aim. Her wrist steadied. Her second shot was to be for Alessandro's head, but Isabella, 3 paces to her left, had already seen the pistol on the concrete beside the body of one of the fallen guards. She had never touched a firearm in her life. Her hand closed around the grip. She lifted it. Her arms shook. She raised the sights, exactly as she had once seen Alessandro do at a private range during their first year together, and she squeezed the trigger with a woman's careful, unpracticed pressure. 1 round. It struck the impostor high in the chest. The woman in the ruined red dress folded backward onto the concrete, her eyes rolling toward the ceiling, her pistol clattering out of her hand and skidding across the floor. Alessandro did not look at the body. He looked only at Emma. Blood was soaking through the wool of her cardigan and through the tactical plate against his own chest and warming his skin in a way nothing in his life had ever warmed him before. Emma's eyes fluttered open. Her lips, gone the pale color of a winter dawn, moved once. "I did not want Papa to hurt." Alessandro's voice tore out of him in a shape he had never heard his own voice make. "Get me a doctor. Get me a doctor now." Marco had already spoken into the encrypted channel at his throat, already summoning the medical helicopter that had been staged on standby at the private helipad 3 blocks north, already clearing the perimeter for a rooftop landing on the warehouse above them. There is a kind of love that only a child can give, a love that does not weigh, and does not calculate, and does not ask whether the one being loved has earned it. In the instant, Emma placed her small body between Alessandro and that bullet, a 6-year-old girl who had grown up alone on the coldest sidewalks of a city that had never once fed her, taught the most powerful man in New York the lesson no one in his life had ever managed to teach him: that family is not born of blood. Family is born of the moment a person is willing to stand between you and death. The medical helicopter lifted from the roof of the warehouse compound 3 minutes after Marco's call, its rotor blades cutting a hard white circle through the harbor fog. Alessandro sat on the folding bench with Emma laid across his knees. A trauma medic worked over her with rapid, gentle hands, packing the wound, running lines, calling numbers ahead to the emergency wing of Mount Sinai. Alessandro said nothing. He only held her hand, and every few seconds he brought that small, warm hand against his own cheek, as though the touch of her fingers were the one thing keeping his own heart from stopping. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Isabella sat in the private waiting room on the topmost floor, her hands still marked with the dried blood of a child who was not her own by birth, her lips moving in the soft, steady rhythm of the same prayer her grandmother had once taught her in a stone chapel outside Palermo. She did not weep. She only prayed, and she waited, and she held the small, crumpled red beret that had fallen from Emma's head at the moment of the shot. That same night, 5 miles away in a private estate along a wooded lane in eastern Queens, Salvatore Ricci sat before a low fire with a glass of red wine in his hand. He was waiting for a call that would never come. 30 of Alessandro's most loyal men came up his driveway in silence. There was no negotiation. There were no prisoners. Alessandro himself walked the length of the marble corridor to the door of the master bedroom. He opened it. Ricci turned in his armchair with the wine still in his hand. 3 rounds ended it cleanly and quickly, without ceremony, without a single word spoken between them. Before the sun rose over the East River, every man who had lifted a hand against Emma or Isabella that autumn was gone from the streets of New York. 3 days later, in a white room on the 4th floor of Mount Sinai, Emma opened her eyes. Isabella was sitting beside the bed. She was singing, very softly, an old Italian lullaby her mother had once sung to her, the same one about a small boat and a silver moon that had rocked so many generations of Romano children to sleep. Emma's brown eyes fluttered open. She saw Isabella. Her pale lips moved into a trembling small smile. "Mama." Isabella broke. She bent forward and pressed her lips to the child's forehead and wept without shame, without restraint, until the pillow beneath Emma's cheek was as wet as her own face. Some months later, Emma was fully recovered. All that remained of the bullet was a small, crescent-shaped scar high on her left shoulder, no larger than a fingernail. The wedding was held on a golden afternoon in the walled garden of the Moretti estate. Only 30 guests were present. Isabella wore a simple white dress with sleeves of soft lace and no train at all. Alessandro wore a plain black tuxedo. Emma walked between them down the flagstone path, one small hand tucked into Isabella's and the other into Alessandro's, carrying 2 little baskets of wildflowers gathered that morning from the far end of the garden. Signora Rosa wept silently in the front row. Marco stood beside Alessandro as his best man, the sleeve of his jacket still hiding the long pale scar from the East Village alley. The moment the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the same judge lifted the second document that had been waiting on the small side table. He signed his name beneath Alessandro's. He signed it beneath Isabella's. And Emma, who had once slept in the vestibule of a cold church because there had been nowhere else, became officially and forever Emma Moretti. The sun sank low behind the far wall of the garden. Its light turned the flagstones to burnished gold. 3 figures stood together beside the old stone fountain, a man, a woman, and a child between them, their long shadows joined into a single, unbroken shape upon the ground. Far away, on the 47th floor of a restaurant overlooking Manhattan, another man in another Alessandro's evening jacket had once stood alone beneath dazzling lights, believing that everything he needed to be a king he had already earned. He had been wrong. Sometimes the loneliest people in the world are the ones who appear to have everything. Sometimes the honest eyes of a homeless child can see a truth that an entire empire has failed to see. And sometimes the family we are searching for is not the one written into any document of blood or law, but the one born in the single moment when someone is willing to stand between us and the bullet meant for us. If this story touched something deep in your heart tonight, take a moment before you go. Tell us in the comments below what you felt as you watched. Has there ever been a stranger in your own life whose small, unexpected kindness changed the course of your days? Or was there a time when you were the one who reached out, without knowing the difference it would make? Your stories are the reason we keep telling ours, and we read every word you leave for us. If this channel has become a small place of comfort in your day, please consider tapping the subscribe button, leaving a like on this video, and sharing it with someone who might need to hear a story like this one tonight. Every subscription and every share helps us bring more stories of hope, courage, and second chances to more hearts around the world. Wishing you good health, peaceful days, and a home filled with love, wherever in this wide world you happen to be watching from. May your life be gentle, and may the people you love always come home safe. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.